of the past 4 years since consumer VR launched and analyze what made them so successful. My name is Tipatat Chennavasin. I'm co-founder and general partner of the Venture Reality Fund. We're the largest independent fund investing in early stage virtual reality, augmented reality, and artificial intelligence startups. In the past, I've been a VR and AR and game developer, but now as an advisor and investor in VR and AR and AI startups, looked at over 5,000 companies in the space and invested in 36, including the makers of some of the biggest games in VR, like Beat Saber, Job Simulator, Rec Room, and others. So before we dive into the games themselves, let's talk a little bit about the state of the current consumer VR market. So it's hard to know exactly how many headsets are out there, but we can look at some other data, including the monthly connected headsets on Steam, and see that for 6 Degrees of Freedom VR, we've seen steady growth over the past almost 4 years now. And what's really impressive, well, I should stop and talk a little bit about specifically 6.VR when we talk about VR, because again, 6 Degrees of Freedom head tracking and 6 Degrees of Freedom hand tracking are essential to make that VR experience that retains users, engages users, and monetizes users. So Sony actually has been pretty forthcoming with their numbers. At CES earlier this year, they said they sold 5 million Sony PSVR. And best guesses are about 5 million PC VR across the Oculus Rift, the HTC Vive, the Valve Index, and the Microsoft MR headsets. So roughly a consumer base of about 10 million connected headsets. But importantly, now we have the Oculus Quest, which was the first all-in-one VR headset that was standalone, didn't need a PC or a console to power it, and that it launched May of last year. And according to Facebook, they are selling them as fast as they can make them. But hardware is just one side of the story. Software is also very important to track because we want to know how many developers are actually making money off of this brand new hardware. And this is actually the more interesting story, because if we look at the numbers, we see slow but steady growth over the past few years since the launch of VR. But then last year, we saw a huge spike, 3x growth, from going from 100 million by the end of 2018 to 300 million in revenue by the end of 2019. And that means over 100 titles have now made over $1 million. And since most of those titles had budgets of less than $1 million, many of them were either break even or profitable. And top VR title can make over $40 million in 1 year. And we expect that lifetime revenue for VR games, that there should be one, maybe even 2 games that top over $100 million in revenue by the end of 2020, which is incredible. And a big reason, like I mentioned, is because of the Oculus Quest. We think that this is really the first true consumer VR device because it's standalone, doesn't have messy or complicated setups, but importantly has 6 Degrees of Freedom head and hand tracking that allows it to play the top VR experiences. It's been available for a year now and was available for this crazy, insane low price of $399 for a starting price in the US. And earlier last month, Facebook announced that they had done over $1 million in software revenue in 1 year alone. And that number is incredible, especially considering where PlayStation VR did about 110 million in revenue last year. And that's with a 5 million install base. And it took them about 3.5 years to get to that number. And the Quest did that in 1 year alone. So now let's do a deep dive into some of these hit games and look at the characteristics that they share, or the characteristics that really make them unique and stand out for the platform. But before that, let's see a list of the highest grossing VR games. This is across all of the platforms up until 2019. So this doesn't capture Half-Life ALYX yet. And if we were to include ALYX would probably be 2 or 3, but it really doesn't really change the story and the characteristics that I'm going to kind of walk you through. So really, again, looking at this list, and they are listed from top to bottom as the highest grossing, estimated grossing on top. You'll notice that, again, the majority of these titles are indie titles. And by indie, I mean titles that have come from independent studios that typically have budgets of less than $5 million, and honestly, typically less than $1 million. And it's not just that the majority are indie. Actually, the top titles, the top 3 titles, are indie. And of course, a majority of these titles are multi-platform, but that doesn't mean they all launched at the same time across all the platforms. Typically, they started on one platform and then eventually migrated to the others over time. We're excited to see a pretty diverse game type. Not, of course, there are some FPS games here, but there's still, especially at the top, a pretty good variety of different types of games, from music rhythm to casual gaming to puzzle gaming, platformers. And so again, it seems like, at least in this early stage, there's a lot of different opportunities for VR, especially to diversify the user base. Also, most of these titles are still single player, mostly new IP, which is very encouraging, because again, we think when new platforms are created, that's when the opportunity for new IPs to be created. And of course, most are native for VR. I think actually Skyrim is the only one that was truly adapted, where they added VR controls to an existing game, whereas others, like Superhot, actually were pretty much reimagined to be VR native. So now let's do a deep dive into Job Simulator. And that's really the first true success in VR. It was made by an independent studio in Austin called Alchemy Labs that was then later acquired by Google after launching Job Simulator and then before the launch of their second game. So for those that aren't familiar with it, it's a very casual, humorous sandbox simulation game about doing different types of jobs, like being an office drone or working in a convenience store or in an auto repair shop. But the whole point of the game was not to necessarily follow instructions and do these little mini quests or activities, but to really explore the area, interact with objects, pick them up, throw them around, combine them in creative ways. It was the first VR game to make over $3 million in 1 year. And it's been the top downloaded PSVR game 3 years in a row. And very important, they emphasize that they had the most views for Let's Play gameplay videos on social media, like on Twitch and YouTube, and across Facebook and other social media platforms. And very important, especially for how you market. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But now, why was it so successful? I think, it really represented the first true VR native core gameplay, where again, if you think about gaming, it's really more about the input than the display. And it understood, and the Alchemy Labs folks, when they got the one-to-one gesture controllers, they realized again that grabbing objects, interacting with objects, grabbing, throwing, physical interactions like stacking or combining, again, was just really enjoyable. And so they built a game that really used that mechanic to its fullest. It was also something that, I've gotten a chance to talk to the team since we were one of the investors, and they often mentioned how, especially for them, VR, it was that hand interaction, but also how things closer to you felt more magical or interesting. And that the further things got away, a little bit because, the less of a 3D effect that you would get, and the less it felt special or unique. So that having things within arm's range was really the hot zone for great VR gameplay and interactivity. The other thing that, is pretty obvious when you look at the game, most people, especially on screenshots, kind of wrote it off at first, thinking, oh, it looked pretty simplistic. But really, it wasn't about the visual fidelity. It was much more about the interaction fidelity. And when you play the game, there's just so much depth, so much different things you could do. And this kind of leads into the next point about something that the former CEO, ALYX, talks a lot about, and it was how important it was to avoid interaction disappointment. And that means that when people take different objects and want to combine them or do things together with them, they expect some kind of result. And you had to give them a result. Even if it wasn't what they expected, you had to at least acknowledge that there was something interesting happening when they were trying to do different things, especially when they're trying to break the world or break the system. And so they did a ton of playtesting and made sure that they captured all the different scenarios to give exciting results. And that allowed, again, for this kind of replayability that again helped get a lot of people to play their game and watch people play their game. And again, they also realized how important it was to have people look interesting while they're playing the game. And so they weren't the ones that developed it, but they really pushed the idea of mixed reality or green screen playing, where again, like in this anime GIF, you could see there's a real live person, and then they're being superimposed or composited over the virtual or into the virtual world and interacting with the objects. It looks like, again, this is the best way to explain what a VR experience can be, because the first person view can sometimes be a little bit hard to read for people. And so this mixed reality spectator mode became a key part of their success, because it was a key part of their marketing and helped get them well known and well played, especially for streamers. Now I want to talk about the next and even bigger VR success, and that was a game called Beat Saber by the Beat Games team, which was an indie studio in the Czech Republic and eventually acquired by Facebook. So for those who haven't played, Beat Saber is a highly addictive music rhythm game where you're slicing music blocks that come at you, or music notes. They made $2 million in 1 month. They had over 4,000 concurrent users, which was somewhere between 3 to 10 times the highest amount of concurrent users of any other VR game at the time. It was the first VR game to sell 2 million copies, do over 40 million in revenue, and have way over now 2 billion views on social media. And like I mentioned, developed by a team of, initially by a core team of 3 devs from the Czech Republic, no outside funding for launch. And what's really great about that was, they really used early access. And when they launched, it was just a single player game with only 10 original songs made by the CEO, unlicensed. And that was enough, again, because the core gameplay was so solid that it pushed them into huge success. And like I said, it's not just about the downloads, it's about that concurrent usage. And you can see in the chart on the right, we can see again how much more engaged that user base has been for Beat Saber or compared to any other game in VR. So again, what really made them successful? And here, I argue again, they took a very native core VR gameplay concept and really perfected it. And that was how nice it feels to slice things. There were actually several other games that had a slicing mechanic, but none of them felt as satisfying as when you sliced in Beat Saber. And that was because of the visual audio, but also the haptics that they did too. It just feels so good to slice. And then they kind of took some of the other things that make arcade games like this work so well. Like, it's easy to pick up, but there's enough complexity that it's hard to master. And so they did really smart things where you get graded on how you slice the blocks, not just what time you do them. And then they also do something that I think most of the most successful VR games have done as well, and they give you this element of wish fulfillment. And this game makes you feel like a badass Jedi. Like, when you're slicing the music, you just feel like you're so incredible. And again, I think a lot of that too was, I think they were the first VR game that really understood movement design. They actually hand mapped their beat maps, they call them, but the level design essentially. Instead of using AI to generate based off beats, they actually made sure, and the core founders were actually musicians. And so they were actually able to make that note reading feel so good that when you move, they actually thought about like biomechanical design. So when you have to duck down, your next move, you swing your hands down, it helps you kind of lift up. It just feels right. So when they do those little things, like, honestly, it's one of the few games that you actually feel good to play, and you feel better playing it over time because you're being healthy, you're being active, and you're losing weight. And people have lost hundreds of pounds playing Beat Saber. And so the other thing, again, like Job Simulator, was really fun to watch people play in mixed reality. And you can see these, the image that's going right now of the person doing the Darth Maul. I can just watch that all day. But what was interesting, again, they went viral with videos like of this mixed reality, had over 1 million views before the game even launched. So people were super excited for when it was finally going to be available. And then the last thing too was it was moddable. And honestly, a lot of games built in Unity can be moddable, but to make a game that's addictive enough where people wanted to mod them and have a mod community sprout up, and then again, not try to control the mod community, but try to work with the mod community, where eventually they would make actually hires for the team from the mod community. To see them really embrace that community side of it, of the mod group, was really, really interesting and a big part of what I think led to a lot of the sustained success that they've had. Now, it's not just these two games, although they've been some of the most successful, but I did want to highlight, several other great games and some of the interesting things that they're doing. I don't have time to kind of walk through them all, but I just wanted to put this up here that you guys can go back to and refer to at a later date. But again, Robo Recall, Super Hot, Rec Room, Walking Dead, Saints and Sinners, Pistol Whip, Boneworks, Budget Cuts. They all do these amazing things in their games, and one of the things I'm kind of shocked at is that more VR developers I talk to actually don't play a lot of VR games. And I think it's very important. You have to think about it almost as like free R&D, where other people are doing things and amazing things. And not saying that, again, it's about, aping or copying, but it's about understanding what works and what doesn't work in this new medium. And then realizing too that a lot of times the bar is being raised, and that when these games come out, they do things in a certain way, and that's going to be expected for all other games moving forward. And I will highlight again Robo Recall that's being shown right here. One of the great things about it is, it's a first-person shooter, definitely, but where the game becomes really interesting is with the rich object interaction of the enemies. So here they're taking one of the enemy robots, ripping off it, grabbing its gun, ripping off its arm, using it as a shield, or throwing the arm at the enemies, blocking the bullets with the body. And actually, I couldn't find a capture of it, but you can actually grab the bullets, throw them back at the enemies, or you can actually grab the arm and hit the bullets back like a baseball bat. Like this type of rich object interaction, it just makes it feel so powerful, creates this kind of sandbox gameplay, and more importantly, lets people do things that they've never done before in a video game. Like, I've been playing video games my whole life, and I've shot plenty of guns, but have I ever ripped off the legs of a robot and thrown it back at another? Not so physically or viscerally. So again, I would just say, look at some of the games on this list, see what they do and see what they do right, and that's moving the art of VR gaming forward. Now, I did want to talk a little bit about common mistakes that come up when a lot of VR game developers pitch me. And the number one rule of VR game design is, and of VR in general, is don't make people sick. I think again, there are a lot of people that are immune to VR sickness and can do anything, but I would say there are still more people that do get sick from VR through bad VR design, not because of the hardware itself, but because of things like artificial locomotion, not just for movement, but also for head turning. And people, try to do things like, oh, hey, we can try to narrow the field of view, or we can, make the turning kind of steps. But because, especially because we're now targeting all-in-one devices without a cord, like the Quest, where people can turn around naturally, there really isn't a need to kind of do button head turns anymore, or joystick head turns anymore. And, artificial locomotion, it'll be hard to always move around or to do big areas, but you can see other games kind of get around this in interesting ways. And some people say, oh, teleport seems so bad, but you can actually make teleport part of the game design, and actually fun part of the game design, which games like Budget Cuts and Robo Recall do very well. The other, and probably the largest mistake I see too, is people still trying to make traditional PC or console games in VR. And by that I mean, it doesn't feel like it's really taking advantage of VR, especially the gesture controls, and the actions feel like they're just pressing buttons, and the enemies are just simple hitboxes that don't interact, that don't have that kind of rich physics interaction that you expect. And I think that breaks the illusion that of the that VR is trying to give people. And so, again, I think this idea of where VR sings, it's not about trying to do what you've been doing, but it's trying to let you do what you've always dreamed you could do and have never been able to do before. And so that's why games where, like Job Simulator and Beat Saber don't feel exactly like any other previous game, because especially in the interaction design, and they really are VR native. So, you really have to think why are you doing this in VR? And it has to be about the interaction, not just about what you see. The other thing I feel like a lot of pitches I get where VR games are trying to do too much. I think they're trying to make, instead of trying to make, Grand Theft Auto 1, they're trying to make Grand Theft Auto 5. And it's just like, especially with VR and it's a brand new medium, we kind of have to walk before we run. We have to think about core game design, core games interaction systems, perfect those, and then build on top of that. And again, that goes back to that like VR native game design. So like instead of designing a huge MMO, just make a core combat game system that people want to play again and again, and then kind of build on top of that. And it might not be, again, as rich or deep as other, as it could be later on. But again, for the first iterations, you just want to make sure that that core gameplay, that moment-to-moment gameplay, is sticky and engaging enough. And like I mentioned, with some of the biggest successes so far, it's not about trying to do too much. It's about getting that core gameplay, polishing it, and making it so juicy and fantastic. The other thing, and I kind of hinted about this earlier, is heavy emphasis on visuals. I think a lot of people, when they think AAA, it has to look a certain way, it has to be super realistic. But again, I think for VR, it's more about being believable than realistic. And when you're in VR and you have proprioception, you can move around, you have that 6 degrees of freedom. It lets you feel like things are believable, even if it's rendered cartoony or less realistic. So I'd say, let VR do the heavy lifting and allow, things, and I'm not saying that, you shouldn't have compelling visuals, but again, it's not about making it look the most high polish, or at least realistic. And you can make it really well designed, really artistic. And I think, Beat Saber is a great example of this. Job Simulator is a great example of this, and many others as well. Another thing too, listening back to the lessons from the Job Simulator team, it's about a lot of games design interactions that are too far away. Immersion, again, is stronger when it's closer. And a lot of times too, that's also because you see and perceive things in 3D much more when it's within 10 feet or I think 15 feet from you. And when it's further away, everything kind of resolves, and it could just be flat. It could just be like a big TV that you're looking at. And so then it just could feel like a regular game. And that's why immersion closer up is just more fantastic. And playing games that are shooting galleries where the enemies are always at a distance just doesn't feel that engaging in VR, and feels much more like a standard game. And then the other game, or the other complex problem I see is relying too much on button pressing for interaction and making it hard to learn or remember to interact, because and it's kind of like game controller fatigue, where again, the best thing about VR is not that you have buttons, but because you have one-to-one gesture control. And so the more things that you can do with the gestures and make it more intuitive, the better the experience is going to be. And again, Beat Saber, a game that really has no button presses except for to start or select. But when you're actually playing the game, you're just swinging. It just feels fantastic to not have to worry about, oh, what do I have to press to do this thing? And so, again, relying on too complex button controls, I think, can be setting you up for failure in VR, at least at this stage. So now I've talked a little bit about game design. I think, again, it's not just about the game design, but also how to market your VR game to get people to play it. Because again, if you make a great game, but you don't know how to market it, then no one will ever find it, and that will be a problem. So I did want to talk a little bit about what we've seen work. And again, the old ways just don't work. Advertising doesn't seem to work anymore. Reviews and press mentions aren't that powerful. And VR, because it's again on PC and it's on console, or it's in its own all-in-one app store, there's nothing like what we have on mobile with paid user acquisition, right? You can't just market spend and just dump money in to try to solve this problem. Really, it's much more about getting streamers to play the game, and that's about making mixed reality videos easy to do and making them very compelling. It's also about having viral hooks. So by that, I mean gameplay that just looks amazing, like in Beat Saber, or I think the Alchemy folks always talk about how they spend a ton of time doing cool things like juggling or other interesting things that they can show off what their engine and what their game can do. That just makes people want to say, hey, I want to do that too. And then the last thing is sandbox gameplay, especially for streamers that they'll all want to play these games. They'll want to inject their own personalities into it. And if people play a game and it just is the same thing every single time, that's not interesting to watch. But if, again, like in something like Job Simulator, where there's a real physics sandbox, people can do different types of interactions that maybe other people hadn't thought of or seen and get amazing results, then people keep coming back. And honestly, I think the most important thing is really being community driven, and this is a lot of work, but it really does pay off. And that means being active on Reddit, being active in Discord, doing things like beta and early access. And one of the things that we've seen too is, so a VR game will make a viral video. Well, what do they do with that audience? Because the game isn't necessarily out yet. Well, they feed them into a Discord, and then they give those Discord users early access or beta and get them involved in the process. And that kind of gets that early champion community that helps you get your first amount of reviews and their first community out there, which again is the seed that then grows into the big hit. Now, of course, I can't talk about hit VR games without talking about Half-Life ALYX. And it's really, the flagship VR title by Valve and the first true AAA game, because again, this is a game that's been 4 years in development with a team of over 80 people at its peak. It's been the highest rated PC game in 2020, one of the top rated games, not just VR games, but games on Steam. It did over 40 million in revenue in 1 month. And now mod tools are available, and so there are mod teams that are building and extending on top of it. And it is an incredible game. Everything I've been talking about has really been advice for indies, but it's really great to see a very veteran, experienced team make something with nearly seemingly unlimited resources and adding this level of polish that on all aspects, from design to environment and art to audio to everything, that just is phenomenal. Let's take a deeper look though, because there's a lot that we can learn from it. So definitely the first thing that people always mention is that visual fidelity. Like, a lot of people talk, I mean, it is hard to make, and this is kind of why I tell people not to focus on high visual, like realistic graphics in VR, because it's hard to do, especially when you have to render at a certain frame rate and you have to render stereoscopic vision. But again, Valve shows that, done right, with great art direction, with the right team, and with the right resources, you can achieve a great look. But I think actually, to me, the most impressive thing about Half-Life ALYX was how they made the gravity guns, which allows a mundane task like picking up objects so fun. It turns it into like a joyous occasion, especially when you use that physics and you grab something in your hand, and it's just so satisfying. And that's actually the thing, that the interaction or the activity that you do the most in the game. And so they really had to nail that. And so understanding that, they put a lot of work to reinvent what picking up an object from the environment can feel like, and they nailed it. And then, if you hear them talk, they always talk about how they actually didn't want to overload the player, didn't want to give them too much power or too many things to do, and really just focus on like key aspects of that level. And I don't want to spoil the game, but definitely I just recommend everyone kind of play through it, and you see there's not tons of enemies that you have to shoot down. It's really, each interaction is very strategic, but it's also not too many people or too many enemies, and it's very satisfying because you can come up with innovative gameplay like what's shown in this clip, where again, typically you'd use a gun, but because it's a VR, you can pick up an object and you can parry it and move it out of the way. The last thing that I wanted to talk about that I thought they did really well too was this idea of environmental design pacing. And what I mean by that is, when you're playing this game, you're in a dystopian, future. It can, especially because there's a lot of horror elements, you're in underground and cramped environments, and it's pretty oppressive. But they will alternate between these like dark, dank, dungeony areas and or like sewage areas, open it up into these courtyards or into these areas where you see a nice vista, and it really changes, it just changes the feel of things. So I think, again, especially in VR, where you're so attuned to the environment, or the environment is all encompassing around you, it's important to be able to understand that people don't want to be in an oppressive environment for too long, and they need the outdoors sometimes, or they need some kind of uh, you know alternate stimulus to really wipe, rinse, and repeat, and so it's not just more of the same over and over. But anyways, I mean, there's so many lessons to be learned from this game. It is a masterclass. I hope everyone will definitely give this one a go if they haven't already, and also really, as they play it, think about it, and think about why it plays the way it does. But again, it's one of the most amazing game experiences I've ever had. But also, too, not something that budget constrained indie could necessarily hope to achieve until the mods. So really, that's my talk. I hope I gave you guys some useful information. And unfortunately, there won't be a Q&A after this, but I wanted to keep the discussion going. So please reach out to me. I'm at Tipatat on Twitter. So I will respond to any questions about this talk. Just again, hit me up on Twitter and ask any questions that you want to know, and I will be happy to respond. Thank you so much. I hope this was helpful, and thank you again.